India, and welcome back to our virtual conference, Pursuit 2021, Combating Financial Frauds with Technology. This event is organized and supported by Invest India and Startup India. Before we begin, I would like to quickly thank our partners, our session partner, Refinitiv, our gold partners, Reactor, Netherlands Embassy, and Cybersprint, and our bronze partner, Onfido, and knowledge partner, EY. With that, let us quickly begin with our next session. This session is a panel discussion, Changing Landscape. And for the same, I would like to welcome our esteemed panelists, our moderator, Mona Zoet, founder and CEO, RegPac Revolution, Timothy Choon, Managing Director, FICO Compliance Solutions, Asia Pacific, Hardesh Singh, CEO and co-founder, RADICALi, and Richard Maton, Director, Aperio Strategy and Executive Board Member, International RegTech Association. We welcome all of you and thank you for being a part of this panel today. I would quickly request Mona to please take over.
Thank you, and thank you for having us today here in India and of course the rest of the world, because this is a virtual event. Yes, so to really talk about the changing landscape in the regulatory technology, I think it would be good to a little bit further introduce our fellow panelists. I have two questions for you guys to more or less, of course, introduce yourself a little bit and a little bit more about your background. But on the other hand, also, what have you seen up until now in the RegTech space that you think is so impactful if you compare it like from the financial crisis till now? And it would be great to have some insights there. So, Hardesh, I start with you.
Sure. Okay. Well, quick introduction. My name is Hardesh, CEO and co-founder of Radicali. We are a RegTech firm headquartered in Singapore, backed by firms that include SG Innovate. What we do is basically help folks in compliance manage regulatory change more effectively, and also to automate basic compliance processes via our digital compliance assistant. Now, in terms of what I've seen in recent years as it relates to RegTech, I think the fact that there's just greater awareness around the vertical of RegTech itself is compared to fintech. You see greater awareness, at least in Asia and this part of the world. You see regulators pushing for greater adoption and awareness with fundings and with RegTech challenges and sprints that are coming out. So that shows that there is much greater awareness, and I think that's just a really good thing to see.
Cool. Richard?
Hi, yeah, thanks, Mona, and hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be here, so thank you very much for the invitation to speak. So my background's technology digital transformation across multiple industries. I was a co-founder of a behavior analytics firm that was used for surveillance for market abuse, so using machine learning to multiple internal data sets, so classic RegTech in a company. We sold that a few years ago to NASDAQ, and I've been working to support early and growth stage businesses with new value propositions that really deliver more effective risk and compliance management, but also drive the cost out. And also in my not-for-profit work, doing work to really examine what does the new collaboration model look like between public policy, regulators, regulated entities, and innovators looking to solve those problems. Because as we move forward and think about the trends in RegTech, that seems to me to be critically important to moving from where we were post-financial crisis, where there was a lot of concern about the amount of regulation, the cost of that regulation, the burden of that, and all the risk associated around that. And I think what we've seen, and I think COVID has been a huge driver of this, is yes, those are challenges and issues, and regulatory risk is clearly a major issue. But there's also, particularly I think on the policy and regulatory side, more of a focus around, well, how do we use these technologies within those risk areas to actually deliver better outcomes, right? So if we think about digital identity, KYC, and the acceleration of that, right, during COVID and the out of that, and that's a foundational technology for access to finance, for better, safer, secure, anti-financial crime solutions and risk management. And as we look forward, we're seeing those macro drivers in things like ESG, right, risk management, transparency for products around those as well. So I think that's the big shift. And I think that collaboration model and being clear about roles and responsibilities to drive understanding, test, and adoption will be key to delivering success in those areas.
Cool. That's a whole handful.
Yeah.
Timothy?
Thank you, Mona, and good day to everyone. Very happy to join this panel. So my name is Timothy Choon. I'm the Managing Director for the Compliance Division in FICO, Asia Pacific. I've been doing this for more than 15 years, so involved in the regulatory space, regulatory compliance space for quite some time. I think in terms of what we're seeing in the RegTech space, I would say there's a couple of things. So first of all is the growing acceptance of RegTech solutions. The regulators are giving the encouragement, and the market is gradually accepting it. But having said that, I think that's a painful reality that despite the the overabundance or the great amount of solutions out there, the adoption itself has been fraught with challenges. And I think when you go down to the practical and the operational aspects of how the RegTech solutions are actually adopted, you see the painful realities and some of the challenges that financial institutions or the buy side are actually facing. And I think it's probably at some kind of a tipping point where it's, over the next near future, we'll see the solutions becoming a staple of the financial process, the regulatory compliance process, or just a stopgap solution for a short-term resolution of some issues. So yeah, it's a landscape that is very dynamic at the moment.
Yeah, and I agree with that, and actually I agree with all of you. But I definitely also see from the financial crisis onwards that of course, and especially being in Asia, and I think Hardesh, you can, and Timothy, you can vote to that too. Is we started maybe a little bit later, right? Because we I guess we started in 2016 to think about really the growth of fintech, and then back then it was really fintech is more. RegTech is more a sub of fintech if you already were talking about RegTech. And slowly solutions came up, whereas of course for instance in the UK and the US and Ireland, for instance, the solutions were already much older in the sense of they already started really after the financial crisis or within the financial crisis. So I guess from a natural perspective, if you look at geographical kind of growth, I mean the bigger or the more scale up companies that are out there that are RegTech companies that have quite a client base, etc., are still a little bit west meets east, right? And maybe also from New Zealand and Australia, but it is still a little bit that way that is coming our way. Not saying that, for instance, but like FICO, that is also from the US and is already based here as well. But I think the big hurdle of the big stream is still that way. But like companies as Hardesh has, they are growing, and we have a few homegrown companies here as well that are now growing the other way around as well. So I think that is from a geographical perspective what we've seen. If you look at what I find very interesting is that I mean, we started to talk, like I said, really from fintech is the main driver, and then RegTech solutions come along because there are some problems in the financial services industry, definitely within the financial crime area, KYC, the manual processes, repetitive processes, much more data, super cumbersome and very difficult to comprehend as a human being. So, something else needs to be done. And so in that area, you see a lot of companies popping up, or if they were already there, they're growing, and other companies are popping up to really solve that kind of problem. I mean, everybody already talked endlessly about, KYC solutions and anti-money laundering solutions and monitoring solutions or transaction monitoring solutions, the reduction of false positives, that kind of stuff. However, what we now see, especially I think also Richard's already said that a little bit, is because of COVID, we do see much more a push into a broader perspective of the whole uplifting of the compliance function. I mean, risk management compliance needs to become more agile, needs to become more risk managing in more efficient and effective way to reduce costs, to stay relevant, because otherwise you probably don't even survive if you only getting bodies into your company, so more people is not working anymore, and those people still make mistakes. The regulation is too complex and too much. So you do see as a whole that the compliance function actually need to change. And for that, you also have to look at other areas in the sense of not only the compliance is, of course, being compliant is everywhere, right? It's not only within the financial services industry, it is also in the corporate industries, it is also within the healthcare and the pharmaceutical industry, etc., etc. So, and I think we do see now also more use cases in those areas. And the other point is also, it doesn't have to be only external related, right? I mean, of course, it is great if you relate your solution towards the policymaker or towards the regulator, but to be more efficient and effective and reduce cost and optimize revenue by, for instance, streamlining internal policies and procedures, you have tools for that these days as well, is equally important in a way. So it is really what we see, it's really an end-to-end kind of uplifting of the risk management compliance function. And having said that, I think Richard also leaned a little bit to that. We also have to look at, what especially the MAS here in Singapore is very, very fond of, a sustainable kind of solution. So how can we embed certain requirements when you onboard a client, or when you look at your solution, that it actually will be sustainable, that can actually help with the environment, that it can help with how we live these days, and how we use our products these days, and that we don't misuse certain or abuse certain tools and people, etc. as well. And that is, of course, one of the newest, that's ESG, what Richard was also leaning towards. That is what you also see, and although it is relatively new, it is upcoming quite quickly as well. So from that perspective, this is a little bit what we've seen during the years, but I really would like to hear from you guys what you really do see from a geographical perspective within the space. Do you see things that are popping up quite quickly, and especially because we can do a little bit Asia versus US versus the UK and Europe, because we are in different time zones. So I would say, Richard, I start with you. So what do you see from the UK and maybe a little bit Europe perspective, from a geographical perspective, in the sense of how change is happening within the RegTech space?
Thanks for that. And I should have added, I'm based in London, right? So and my background's very much
not Europe anymore.
Well, we're still in Europe, just not in the EU. But I think we didn't move out off the west coast of America.
Okay.
But, so we're not in the EU, and that is important, actually. So all joking aside, and we'll come on to Europe. So in the UK, as you actually quite rightly said, Mona, there was a lot of drive and support around RegTech and its adoption post financial crisis, and particularly by regulators, both the Bank of England in their prudential capability, and the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, and so I think where are we state of play? So I think increasingly that early work, including a lot of work around regulators involved with or driving the innovation agenda, so running tech sprints on industry problems, convening the industry to understand and test how specific technologies solve specific problems more effectively from a regulatory perspective. I think that's evolving now to with the recognition that there are barriers to adoption, and how can policymakers and regulators, what's their role in overcoming those barriers to adoption? So we see things like this year, the digital sandbox, where the regulator created synthetic data sets to test so that new solutions could be tested on some key problems. So we see fraud as we mentioned. We see access to finance, and that's been created in response to asking for these kind of assets where they can work with regulators to get a view around the regulatory effectiveness to overcome some of those potential barriers to adoption. So at a practical level, we see those initiatives evolving. I think perhaps as significantly at a policy level, both in the UK to some extent, but certainly within the EU to a greater extent, we see RegTech solutions being called out at an EU level as foundational approaches to the digitalization of finance and the benefits of that. So we see that RegTech called out in the EU's digital finance strategy and policy recommendations. Last year, we see the EBA have just published a survey into RegTech and its adoption and the barriers of that. And we've seen some very specific recommendations that operate at a policy level where they see the role of policymakers and regulators as removing barriers, but also proactively adopting those. So, for example, on KYC, looking to harmonize standards of KYCs across the member states, the 27 member states, so that when you do adopt technology solutions as an entity, they're more effective, they're more impactful, rather than having to calibrate those for different identity attributes, for example, and a similar extension to the principles of AML. So and that fits with the creation, the proposal to create a pan-EU AML initiative as well. So I think both of those, so that policy framework, recognizing where there are barriers can be removed, but how they can be more proactive on things like standards and harmonization, plus continuing to evolve testing mechanisms that move from just innovation to adoption, I think are the two big macro drivers. And you see interest in those in other jurisdictions, including the US. So closest people working with the US federal regulators on their innovation, and plays out a different way because of their structure, but it's very similar design principles, right?
Right. And Timothy, do you see similar, because you're working for a US headquartered company, but you're of course here in Singapore. But what's your view? How do you see it? Do you agree a little bit, Richard, or do you have other?
Yeah, I agree. Generally that the mindset now towards innovation is much more open, and in terms of the adoption, and in terms of the technology-wise, I think you can see in the US they are actually moving ahead with all kinds of advanced technologies, pushing out a lot of new practices and processes. Just for example, now we see some banks starting to experiment or explore combining or consolidating financial crime as a whole, fraud and compliance, regulatory compliance into one division under one management, and then using technologies that consolidates this kind of tracking and monitoring. Whereas, in this part of the Asia, it's a bit more diverse. You have the more open regulators or economies like Singapore, Hong Kong, which is more maybe more sophisticated, whereas other regions may be more traditional in their approach and how they adopt new technologies. So it is kind of a east versus west, as you described, and I think there's reasons or historical reasons behind, but with the I guess it really depends also on the market itself, how ready they are to adopt this. And we've seen that in many regions, or the adoption goes through kind of a couple of phases. Generally 4 phases, where first phase is you're still primarily using traditional methods, and you use kind of advanced technologies as a complement or as an afterthought, and then you move towards a higher phase where the technologies become a complement, and they actually can drive some of your traditional methods to better fine tune and for better accuracy. And then you finally move to a stage whereby you let the advanced technologies drive your monitoring processes and strategies, and the traditional methods become an afterthought. So I think it's kind of a process, phased approach that many institutions go through, and that's the landscape, the changing landscape from east to west.
Yeah. And Hardesh, what do you think?
Well, there's not much left to add to that. After
Well,
coming after Rich,
that's something else.
yeah, but I think look, from what we're seeing, from what I've seen, locally for Asia at least, and to some extent the Middle East and also the UK, RegTech, primarily amongst fintech and small entities, RegTech typically has been synonymous with the AML and KYC solutions, right? And because we are not, for example, in our case, we're not in the AML KYC space, so it's probably easier for us to have more conversations. But what we see is beyond that push, because folks are still very reactive when it comes to adopting RegTech, all right? So what you see is primarily when you talk about RegTech, you see, most firms have adopted some sort of solution to mitigate AML or KYC risk. But beyond that, they're still working off spreadsheets. And most people, right up to banks to fintechs, are working on spreadsheets. That's telling you how pervasive or how deeply embedded RegTech is in this part of the world, or let alone in the Middle East or the UK. So there's still a lot of opportunities. So in terms of implementation, it's still not very harmonious, I would say, right? So and the reasons for that, I think Richard has touched on some of them, and I think Timothy's touched on some of them as well. But from my personal experience, folks are still very reactive, right? And then you've got budgetary concerns because compliance folks, the compliance function is still a cost center, right? And solutions that are available are still very fragmented. And the options that are being presented to compliance teams, like, okay, look, you're not just here to manage one type of risk. You've got probably other risk topics that you have to manage. Are you expected to get a solution, one solution for every kind of risk category you're hoping to manage? So it's not sustainable, right? Which then, pushes folks like us to come up with solutions that are much more nimble, much more agile, that are less fragmented, that offer you more, right? And allows you to generate higher return on your investment. So that's the challenge for us, but that's kind of what we're seeing locally on the ground. So you're battling folks who are still very comfortable operating off spreadsheets to folks who are, quite advanced in terms of their adoption of technology, not just RegTech, right?
Yeah, that is interesting. A few interesting points that you make there, because I guess, of course, Singapore is pretty much really trying to be the good guy in the school, and of course we are also having a great infrastructure and great regulatory framework. So it's relatively easy because we are a city state to become digital relatively quickly. And even here in Singapore, I fully agree with you. There are banks still, even maybe not only banks, but working with spreadsheets and yeah. So from that perspective, you would say at least in Singapore, we will already know that the tech adoption as a whole is actually in the cards, and the government is really supporting that. So, and we're just a little bit talking about, and actually I thought it was an interesting one to bring up as well, is like, and Richard said it a little bit too, there's one school that says we need to have certain standards globally so that everybody knows, how to adopt, implement RegTech in a certain way, and knows also why it's so beneficial for you, and etc. But of course, you can only have those standards, if you will, if you are all relatively more or less on the same page, right? Well, at this point in time, like you're also, Hardesh, like you're also saying, even if we in Singapore think that we have maybe certain solutions and we can implement them and we are comfortable with it, it might be in Malaysia there are other rules and regulations around it, and they can't even do it, or they're so behind, or the awareness is not there yet, etc. So even if then, and the other thing is what you also touched upon, is the visibility. I mean, yeah, there may be a handful solutions that you can choose from, but you might have heard from certain solutions, but where can you get them? Where can you, is there a platform that actually really says, okay, here are all the solutions and they're categorized and they're great. So that is more or less a little bit, that certification where we just talked about. And I think Richard and you Hardesh have quite a different opinion about that. So I would really like to first ask Richard, please provide your opinion about that kind of structure that could be in place, or that is at least something that is being discussed in the industry as well. And then, of course, I would like to hear your reaction as well, Hardesh and Timothy.
Yeah, so I think so. You absolutely correct that one of the barriers to adoption is just the fragment, just the sheer number of RegTech solutions out there, the fragmentation of those, the inconsistencies in which they describe what they do, how they do it, and that absolutely speaks to Hardesh's point, right, about that kind of confusion out there, on top of a number of other barriers. And so I think you do see. So in the work that's being done within the industry, so with regulated entities, with supervisors, with solution providers, there's a kind of common message that says it would be helpful to have more consistency around and clarity around how the solutions and the underlying technologies within those solutions, and that's important, right? To understand the underlying technologies solves a specific problem, if you like, within the value chain for the regulatory problem. So whether that's fin crime, whether that's regulatory horizon change or ESG, whatever that problem is, there's a value chain of solution technology and solutions. So some kind of clarity and consistency and some shared understanding of that, and particularly when it comes to the newer providers, where there's additional risk for entities of just onboarding, right, a new provider versus a legacy established providers. So I think you see a couple of market drivers for that, right? So one of it is just, I think Moni, you spoke about it, which is, can we find a way to more consistently categorize, align those, and evidence the impact, the regulatory effectiveness, and the efficiency of those? And you see people trying to solve that through market solutions, some successful, some less successful for various. I think there's a huge need and opportunity for that. And perhaps related to that, you also see this notion of perhaps it would be useful to have some kind of certification body for the effectiveness of the solutions. And you see in the US, the FDIC are proposing or put out a proposal to create an independent certification body for fintech solutions generally, and this is particularly aimed at smaller financial institutions who don't have the procurement and the necessary expertise to evaluate. This is some kind of asset. You see that there's certainly thinking underway in the UK around that, and you certainly see that as a recommendation that came out recently in the EU RegTech survey and report. And I think the advantage of that is it helps us standardize, the standards around what an effective solution looks like, and to give more confidence to a buyer of that solution, whether that be a regulated entity, whether that be the supervisors themselves. And the one thing we haven't spoken about is the growing recognition by supervisors that they cannot operate effectively unless they're using new data sources, new technology and techniques to supervise more effective as well. So they're pretty much in the same boat as financial institutions.
Yeah, and Hardesh, I know that you said, but yeah, when you start a business, it is already difficult enough to come up with your product, and you're already glad that you actually built something, and that's already encouraging. So why would we, really would like to have these extra kind of requirements or stamps on top of that, and that will maybe also a little bit be difficult for an entrepreneur who needs to be creative and etc. So can you please elaborate on that?
Look, I think it's really important, especially if you're in RegTech and if your solution is there to alleviate some of the pain points for compliance and risk and compliance folks, that you should have some basic standards in place. Some of those obviously relate to information security, right? Do you have your basic standards in place? Now that is, I think, quite crucial. But beyond that, in terms of certification, I mean, I would really have to question what is the intent of that, because and I'm speaking for all entrepreneurs right now, we come out basically to solve problems, right? For a given set of people who have very specific pain points. Now, in the conversations that I've had, with folks from different, entities in financial services, whether we have, whether we are certified by a body as a RegTech, as being a RegTech entity, has never come up, right? The only certification that's ever come up is, look, what are your information security, controls?
Yeah.
Have you got relevant certifications for that? So my point is that I don't think we should be making it harder for folks who are working off Excel spreadsheets. So they're really handicapped by the lack of access to tools. Their jobs are already difficult and getting worse each day, right? They're a cost center. So why are we making lives much more difficult for them, right? Instead of telling them, look, hey, it's really easy to adopt technology, and most solutions that are coming out today are super nimble, super agile, and super easy to implement and integrate. So the vendors are doing their very best to provide really compelling, solutions and products. Let's not make it more difficult for folks who are really having a hard time, basically, right? That's my position.
Right. Timothy, because I want to react upon that as well, but
Yeah.
Timothy, first would like to hear your reaction.
I think it's a very interesting point because I think it revolves around how do we improve the adoption of RegTech solutions, and we brought up a couple of points, and it goes to the whole spectrum where on one spectrum you have regulators encouraging or giving the blessing to advanced technologies like RegTech, and then on the other hand you have some that are a bit more hesitant or wait and see kind of attitude. But from the firm's perspective, the financial institutions more, I think they understand that RegTech technology is good by its very nature. It's a good technology to have, but sometimes they are besieged by issues like infrastructure, like cost, and then issues like how do you actually implement and integrate it, operationalize it into the overall value chain, the whole process, such that it doesn't make my Excel spreadsheet become even more cumbersome. How do I actually make it more efficient and meet the basic requirements of regulatory compliance or compliance in general? I think that's the $1 million question that everyone is trying to get to the solution.
Yeah, and that's an interesting one, and that's exactly the route I wanted to take as well. I think, Hardesh, I fully agree with you from the beginning in that when you start try to solve a problem, like you're saying very wisely, because I think that is the only thing that you need to do, not just for the sake of a solution. You just actually really try to solve a pain point that either you felt yourself or that the industry really has that, and that's what you try to do, right? But my certification or that whole requirement standardization around it would not so much be when you just start to build this solution. I think it would be much more in that phase that you try to sell it to either a large incumbent or more traditional company, or a company that actually is the buyer. And do you know, and that's another side question from me, do you know, unless you have been in that company and you have felt the pain yourself, and so you know the way the whole procurement or whatever goes, and which steps needs to be taken, and who the approval persons are, etc., that do you know how to sell your product to that kind of company, right? And I think it is, in a way, let's put it that way, a little bit win-win. If you don't know it really, or not know that well, actually it will help you probably to actually know how to get into that large incumbent and how to sell it, and how to ask, right, from both sides, the right questions to make sure that you can actually implement it relatively smoothly. But 9 of the 10 times, well, from my experience, doesn't really happen. A lot of solutions are being implemented by, for instance, large incumbent banks, because another bank did it as well. And even if the if the whole deal was a little bit tricky and delayed and cumbersome and whatever, the other bank just thinks, well, at least I know that the other bank has this solution, so I go for that one as well. And I personally don't think that is the right way to go about. Is it the right solution for you? Is it the right solution for what you need? Did you prioritize that kind of? I mean, I think there are a lot of questions around it that maybe needs a little bit more, first of all, knowledge, but also to discuss it and with the right parties. And I think that could also be a part of the certification, in the sense of that what is out there, what the standards are, and then also that makes it for both parties easier to implement. But yeah, that is definitely my opinion.
No, I understand, and I think. Look, I mean, I'm personally not convinced, but I'll share a story as well.
Yeah.
We spoke to a large insurer, right? And they sought us out looking for a solution, and so we were recommended. And when I asked, what's your timeline for implementing a solution like this? And they said, look, we've got 12 months to implement to go digital. And when I heard that, it just blew my mind. Like, because I told them, look, we can go live in 2 weeks and you need 12 months. That's saying something, right?
Yeah.
That's saying something. So how do you possibly hope to innovate, to introduce efficiencies when your very process for doing that takes 12 months? Right? So that is another elephant that's in the room that people just have to address. If you're going to go out there and seek vendors of any kind, RegTech or FinTech, right? You have to look at your internal processes, right? And perhaps maybe a certification body may help. I'm not sure how, but that is still something that needs to be addressed. And who is best, placed to address that? That remains to be answered, I guess, right?
No, I agree. And Timothy, can you because you are also a long time in that business of selling your products to large incumbent. Do you have any things to add from your experience?
Well, I was going to bring up the consortium approach, but Hardesh is probably going to disagree with that. But in the industry, what we've seen, and especially for financial crime models, there's a tendency to think that I can learn from past experiences from other institutions, especially when it comes to crime patterns, trends. If someone has put in some kind of crime monitoring techniques, maybe I can learn from that. And there is a school of thought that the consortium approach, where they consolidate the learnings and the techniques, may help. Not always, but there's some learnings that you can get from that. And the more you share, the more likely you are to detect, illicit, proceedings or crime that you otherwise may not have been able to detect so easily. So, maybe it's not a certification per se, but it may be more of a consortium sharing or some kind of mechanism by which the consortium can share their experiences or the domain and how do they implement or integrate advanced technologies like RegTech solutions into their everyday to day process. It's a very simple illustration. If your Excel spreadsheet says one result that someone is suspicious of a crime, but your RegTech solution says no, this guy is actually okay, he's not suspicious. How do you reconcile that? Do you have a process? Do you have a framework that actually guides you into how you can come to a better decision and streamline the whole process? These are the things that actually a consortium approach might be of some benefit, where there's kind of a mechanism by which everyone can share their experiences.
Mona, I think Timothy's onto something here. No, I agree with that because I think the problems are quite well known when it comes to compliance. It's been talked about, quite a bit. But I think what's not perhaps very well known is, how those problems are being solved. The many ways in which they can be solved by the, various solutions that are in the market, and that kind of sharing, I think, will be very impactful for folks who are looking to, to adopt such solutions.
Yeah. No, okay. Cool. Yeah. No, I fully agree there. I think there needs to be much more awareness around, how you can actually help each other to implement or to actually look for a solution, maybe even, right? But again, I think it goes along with also that you need to know what is out there, and as long as that visibility is not totally, 100%, because it's not a listed company, whatever, etc. You can't just open up the internet and you get all those companies that might be the best of the best, right? So you don't know, and it might be on the other side of the world that the solution is great, right? So I think the visibility is relatively behind from that perspective, because we are in different time zones with regard to different phases in where the solution of the quality of the solutions are already there still. I mean, and that won't change that quickly, I think. But if you look at if you think ahead, right? I mean, okay, we all agree that RegTech has a huge potential, and the solutions are already there, and the adoption is there, maybe a little bit slow still. or not to its fullest potential. But if we look at the roadmap for RegTech adoption within now and, like say, 5-10 years time, what is your opinion about that? What do you think that would actually within now and 10 years time have happened? Whether we have other pandemics or not, but what's your view? Timothy, start with you.
I would start with from a compliance perspective, a regulatory compliance perspective. So regulators are the ultimate consumers of RegTech solutions or outputs, because the more efficient, the less noise that's being generated means that the regulators have a better tool to monitor and detect syndicates or criminal proceedings across the whole industry. So at a macro level, the regulators do have a role to play. Maybe it's not actually driving it, but they do have a role to play in facilitating maybe some of the consortium sharing that I mentioned earlier. These are things that they can actually put across to help the industry move ahead. And ultimately, it helps the regulators be in a better position to stop or at least reduce crime that can impact the whole industry. So I guess that goes to the root of the whole RegTech, that it really helps the regulators, at the end of the day.
So it's the regulator's tool.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, Richard,
I completely agree. No, I completely agree with Timothy in terms that.
Okay, then we can go to. No.
Yeah. I'm just going to give you some reasons more reasons why Timothy is right. So, in terms of the future is a system design where, and the foundational level for that is data, where there's real-time access to data. So there's real-time understanding exposure and management of risk. Right, that's ultimately the goal, and that requires. But that requires, a holistic view around that system design, right? So not just at an institutional, but at a system level and internationally. And I think and what's going to drive that is also the fact is it's not just an efficiency around existing controls and systems. There's also some fundamental deficiencies, particularly when it comes to areas like crime, where the only way to really effectively spot the most damaging criminal networks is by being able to share data, not just within, but across jurisdictions, because that's how they manage to perpetuate their crime, right? Across jurisdictions, across institutions, knowing full well that data is very difficult to share and sometimes impossible to share that data. And even if you can share that data, there aren't systems in place to actually spot and monitor that. So that's why and the good news on that, you do see new initiatives emerging, such as transaction monitoring utilities out of the Netherlands and Nordics, that are building on some design principles we see with KYC utilities, where they're finding the right regulatory frameworks and the right technology solutions to share that data and consume that data more effectively to fight crime. And that's got to be the direction we travel, not just in financial crime, but in all regulatory risk across all industries. But what the roadmap to that is, but I'll come back to the roadmap, because the roadmap's foundation is data and the ability to extract quality data, consume that data within a system within your institution or within a consortia type environment, right? And there's some of the solutions to that are technology solutions to that, including, I think, a growing importance of federated learning techniques, which include privacy enhanced, new privacy enhancing techniques, but also some of the solutions to that is a balance at a policy level between the value of things like data protection for privacy purposes, with the allowing some data to be shared to combat crime, right, and outcomes. And I think that's the policy balance that a lot of regulators are now grappling with. And the other positive mechanism on that roadmap, I think, are, for example, in crime, are these public-private partnerships, where there's these vehicles to actually have these discussions. Have we got the balance right on this between data privacy versus combating serious crime, right? What's the role then of technologies in enhancing our ability to do that? And so I think those forum and those models and those design principles will just become more and more important. And the key thing will be, how do we then connect those across jurisdictions, right? So where it's necessary to do that, we can really become effective on areas like crime, cyber, etc.
Yeah, so public-private collaboration on a global scale, I guess. Hardesh?
Yeah, so, well,
Floor is yours.
Sorry?
Floor is yours for another 4 minutes.
Well, I think 10 years is a really long time.
Okay.
Lots of
You're retired by then.
Yeah, lots can change in 3 years, right? I mean, so maybe I'll just speak to what I think, the roadmap is like the next 3 years, at least from the perspective of, being in Asia. I think regulators will definitely try to emulate, success stories like what the FCA has done to promote, RegTech. And I think, personally, I would like to see a lot more of that. Greater partnership between vendors and entrepreneurs and RegTech firms and regulators, because I just think regulators are most incentivized to champion the adoption of RegTech. I agree with everything Richard said about data, and I think I see greater adoption of SupTech solutions by regulators and supervisors. I see greater connectivity between solutions that are RegTech solutions and those employed by regulators. I see less fragmentation of solutions in the market. You will start seeing folks really stressing on how connected and interoperable their systems are, how they can solve for multiple use cases. That I see as being the future, and really moving very swiftly away from your standard GRCs that have been flavor of the day, right, for today, right? So I see a lot happening in the next 3 years. And I think the larger question, which I don't have the answer for, is with the rise of DeFi, right, decentralized finance, what happens to compliance?
Yeah.
How do you, will there still be compliance, right? And how will regulators approach that space effectively? And the manner in which they do will have implications for folks like us. So that's what I think.
Yeah, and that's definitely something I guess we can talk about for hours, because I don't think anybody has already that kind of an answer, right? Because it is coming up and everybody's talking about it, but we are also just people that try to cope with the whole change in innovation that is just accelerating quite a bit, whether it's in compliance or whether it's really broader. So yeah, I think, well, I mean, I know we have only 2 minutes, first of all, I really already would like to thank you very much for this session. I think I thought it was really interesting, and I definitely would like to talk hours with you guys, but we don't have time. But so just for the audience and just to a little bit food of thought before before you walk away. Just thinking, do you have maybe some, and then I think Timothy and Hardesh more from a vendor perspective, like, what would you tell this guy, entrepreneur, whatever, or girl, who says, okay, now I'm going for a RegTech solution because this is a problem I want to solve. What would you tell that girl, guy, like, how to, what would be the tips that you would like to give so that they don't fall into maybe the same challenges that you have had in the past? And then, of course, Richard, maybe you can say it a little bit also from the large incumbent or the buy side perspective. I think that would be a nice way to close this off.
Wow. Well, I think I would just ask them to join my company.
But then you're not an entrepreneur.
Yeah, but I think, look, if anyone wants to get into entrepreneurship in RegTech, I mean, there's a lot that's happening, I think, beyond AML and KYC. Just spend a lot of time understanding specific problems and pain points, right? What we typically see a lot of folks who start with one kind of solution that has got nothing to do with compliance, and they innovate or they adapt and pivot into compliance, right? Because there are a lot of problems in compliance, right? So, spend a lot of time understanding your customer.
before you start. Okay, cool. Timothy? Sorry, I can't hear you.
I would agree with that. I think the key is to first identify the problem statement that they're trying to solve. What is the solution meant to resolve what issues, and then look to operationalize it. Don't just focus on the technology, but help the institution to integrate it, have the right mindset, gain internal acceptance, and actually make the solution a part of the whole operational process, and really, solve the problem statement that they have set out for from the beginning.
Cool. Richard, you the buy side.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can't. I'm not in the buy side. I haven't been in the buy side,
No.
but I do work with a lot of people on the buy side through various, engagements and forums, so and networks that operate. So I think the flip side, I think exactly the same point. So it's being clear about the problem. I think just being proactive around. I know that huge pressures, right, for risk and compliance functions just to operate and keep there, but yeah. How's the effectiveness impacted? And I want to pick up on a point Timothy made earlier. It's not about a rip and replace, right? Usually, if you're on a legacy, right, it's around how do I incrementally sometimes, or maybe some more transformationally, introduce new tools and techniques to my existing processes, and manage that change and be clear, about what that impact will be. And I think more, but how a kind of from a more of a strategy and a transformation, I think at a senior level, right, within institutions, this RegTech, whatever the function is part of this digital transformation journey that incumbents are on. I think there's a question there around fintechs. Fintechs are digitally native. They don't have the legacy problems that have other problems. And I know, quite well people in legacy institutions and some of the biggest valued fintechs, the compliance function, and have a view, right, about what the role of risk and compliance is, and the role and the relationship with the supervisor, and on fundamental things like access to data and how that should work. But I think that's
Richard,
where
you have 2 seconds. Sorry, but we really have to.
That's where we're going to go. So risk and compliance, yes, but they need the support of the broader organization to see this as a strategic change. The better.
Okay, guys, thank you very much. I already got a few reprimands that we actually are over time. Thank you very much for this session. And Hardesh, Richard, Timothy, have a great day, evening.
Thank you.
And bye-bye.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Audience.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you to all the panelists for joining in. It was a really lovely session. And thank you to the audience for your questions. We'll be back with yet another exciting session shortly. Thank you.